Our two Peters, Peter Atkins at the end, Peter Williams sitting next to me here, and David Papineau in the middle. So you had an opportunity to listen to them, and then you've had half an hour to digest what they said, and so now you'll all have some fantastic questions to ask them, but I would ask you to keep them fairly brief and snappy, okay? Otherwise I'm going to cut you off. So.
Just a question to David. You, I think, alluded to what appeared to be a Zeno's paradox, where an infinite regression has to have some sort of finite natural end. My question is, although Professor Atkins obviously said that science is capable of determining that finite end, you said it has to be determined by us without relying on science, because science is incapable of doing that. How do you know when you've reached that natural finite conclusion?
I'm not sure. I don't have any strong... So this is the regress of explanations. So you might explain one thing in terms of something else, and my thought was, well, at least in physics, you're going to get to some basic laws at some point, and then you'll stop. You'll have to stop, and some things are going to have to be taken as given and not explained. Now, it's true, in the history of science, we keep on managing to get a bit further, and the things that I was suggesting we might have to stop with if I'd done a fuller talk, like conservation of momentum and energy, Peter was suggesting, well, science can now explain that in terms of certain symmetries. And I think I'd be happy to hand over to Peter. Do you think there's a natural stopping place, or should science always keep looking for further explanations of wherever it's got to?
Well, I think in the instance that I gave, the natural stopping place was the mathematics of the theorem that related symmetry to conservation. So once you've got that theorem established, which is a theorem within mathematics, then you've got effectively the end of explanation. You can ask then, what is mathematics? And then you could say that mathematics is just a kind of logical concatenation of concepts, or whatever. But I think that you're at the end of physics when you've got an equation. Have a go.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be too adversarial, but I don't think that's a good answer. I mean, there's a pure mathematics where you can prove theorems, and then there's the physical reality which one one has in mind, is going to have the same structure as the mathematics. But then it's an empirical fact that the physical reality has that structure, not a mathematical truth, and that's something which has to be taken as given. It's not mathematically proved.
Nonsense. If that's not being adversarial, what is it when you are adversarial? I think that you've raised, actually, we're drawing out of this a very deep question, I think. And I think the deep question is why mathematics works as a description of physical reality. And I think that is a deep question that if we understood the answer, and maybe you can begin to see the answer in some way, that would, I think, bring us together, wouldn't it?
Good. I mean, that's exactly what I had in mind. I have a view about the relation between mathematics and physics that I was appealing to, but I think perhaps we aren't going to be able to thrash this out here in the time available.
We've only got a margin the size of Fairmouth.
My question really is about the significance of attaching ism to science and turning science from science into scientism, because the whole point to me of empiricism is that it's based upon actions and events that have already taken place and upon the analysis of those actions. Do you think that by attaching ism to science that you're creating something dangerously normative because you're turning it into something that is describing purpose and meaning in a way that science shouldn't? It's looking forward rather than looking backwards.
I think this must be for you.
Have a quick, just a one-liner there. I think it's in order to render it derogatory.
So I said I was adopting this terminology scientismist, but it's a slightly odd thing to confess to being scientistic, because scientistic, I think, is generally understood to mean taking scientific ideas and methods and applying them where they're not going to be useful and helpful. And even I think that sometimes happens. People take simplified scientific ideas and apply in one area and then try and apply them somewhere else. So, an idea that certain traits are genetically controlled, and then they apply them to homosexuality or other things that aren't genetically controlled, and I think that's probably called scientistic. I wouldn't want to be a scientistic person who thinks that you can apply science more widely than it should be.
But where to draw the line?
Well, I mean, there'll be cases and cases, and I don't think science can tell people what's important. I don't think science should tell people what to do, and I think if somebody comes along and says science can do that, that's a mistake.
Sorry, I don't want to hog this.
No, go on quickly.
Yeah, but just
Yeah.
one final remark. Then I think scientism is the way that we're using it is that science should be pressed as far as it can be, in the hope that explanations will emerge. And if we run up against barriers that are just too big for science, then we just have to say, well, that's a higher order phenomenon of something. Yeah.
Peter Williams. Shall we?
Yeah, well, I'd actually be happy to agree with Peter Atkins on that one. I'm not saying we should arbitrarily limit where science can look, but just to address the point that the questioner raised, this distinction between sort of describing reality by looking at it, looking back at it, and then you raised questions of sort of meaning or purpose, and we also had questions of how should we behave, as different from a merely sort of ethnographic description of how have people behaved, or how do people behave. That to raise the moral question of, well, how should we behave, I think precisely is to raise one of those questions that is sort of brushed off the table by a scientistic approach to knowledge that tries to say all questions are within the domain of science. I think that's precisely the kind of question you raise that pretty obviously isn't within the domain of science.
Well, I think it is. I think how we should behave somehow comes into accepting conventions, somehow seeing what leads to the stability of societies. And I don't see why one can't analyze, using a scientific empirical approach, that kind of question.
Brief response?
Can I just do some? My ideas about shoulds and morality are very much in flux, but so I don't have clear views on this. But here's one thought: look, science can tell us, look, you should do this because, and then it will adduce some empirical facts that if you do this, you'll be healthy, society will flourish. If you don't do it, there'll be strife and disease, so it can tell you should do these things because that's what will come out of it. Somebody who starts asking, well, why should I care about being healthy, about suffering and so on? I'm not sure that science has got much more to say, but I'm not sure that anybody has much more to say at that point. Somebody who's asking, well, why should I care about suffering? Seems to me asking a bad question. If you don't care, well, it's kind of tautologist, it seems to me. I mean, look, I say, look, you do this, it's going to cause, that poor child's going to suffer. And they say, well, I see that, but why should I not do it? And I say, well, okay, not only is this going to cause the child to suffer, but it would be wrong. And it seems to me adding, and it would be wrong, isn't really doing much work. If I've got somebody who's not moved by suffering, it seems to me I'm clutching at straws if I hope they're going to be moved by my saying it's wrong.
But then, but then you have to ask, well, why do societies result in people who are altruistic and who do look after people who are suffering and so on. And I think that is open to scientific empirical investigation.
Very, very interesting question. But note that somebody who isn't altruistic, you're not going to somehow persuade them to be altruistic by looking at the evolutionary explanation of altruism. I mean, it's
no, but science is about understanding. It's not necessarily about prediction.
Good.
Let's have the next question. Now, who's near a microphone? This gentleman down here.
Is a moral value judgment expressed by an atheist inferior to that expressed by a man of faith? And that's to you, Peter, religious man, there.
Peter Williams, okay.
I am of the position that an atheist is equally, if not better able than a religious person to recognize the moral value of various states of affairs, to recognize that you should not torture small children just for the fun of it, etc., and that they are well able of mounting good arguments in defense of certain moral rules, moral normative systems for helping you to guide your action, etc., etc. Where I would make a distinction is, given that one is a moral objectivist who thinks there are such things as objective values and duties, that I think the difference comes in the question of which worldview can best explain the existence of such a thing. So I think, an atheistic moral philosopher like Russ Schaefer-Landau does an excellent job of defending the existence of objective moral values, and he can recognize them and he can defend their existence and so on against the moral subjectivist. But when it comes to the question of, well, how come there is such a thing as, objectively speaking, the right thing to do? Which worldview best explains that? Then I simply think that a theistic worldview best explains that fact.
Is that your answer just because you're a talker of the VHA?
No, that is my answer whenever I've addressed that issue in all of my published works and all of the talks that I would have given on it, which you can look up for free online.
Yeah, that's the William Lane Craig answer as well, isn't it?
Yeah, as far as I understand it, that is the standard Christian philosophical position on the matter. I mean, even to give you a biblical reference for this, so this is the biblical view. St. Paul in the letter of Romans says that even the Gentiles who do not have the law show that they have the law written on their hearts because their consciences now on one occasion condemns them, on another occasion says no, they've done the right thing. So the biblical New Testament position is that you don't need to believe in God or believe in the Bible or any of that in order to know and on occasion do the right thing.
I think
I've got a thought, but it's not quite an answer to the question. It's just on your supposition that you've got a better account of the nature of morality than me. And as far as I can see it, both accounts hinge on the idea that some intelligent being has certain aims and purposes. Now, I have the aim and purpose of avoiding needless suffering, causing human well-being, mine and others. Many other people have that aim too. The people I trust, that I want to associate with, all have that aim. And that's kind of good enough for me. That's going to give me reason to do all kinds of things. Now, you tell me that's not good enough, and there's some other being, and he has certain aims, and that somehow underpins my doing the things that I do. And I think, well, hang on, why do I need another being? What's that adding? What was wrong with my purposes? Why does there have to be somebody else with the purposes to whom I'm subservient? It seems it's like an explanation of just the same kind as I already have, but one that's adding some extra stuff that is not particularly helpful.
Sure. Well, to give it, again, we have a marginalia of opportunity to make responses here, don't we? But I think given that there are objective duties and values in the world, there must be some sort of normative standard that is independent. It's something we discover rather than we invent, so it transcends you or me or us. We can ask questions like, is such and such a culture pursuing the values that it ought to? Is that a value, lessening human suffering, that I am objectively obligated to pursue, and so on. So there's this transcendent objective quality to these moral facts that we encounter. But on the other hand, moral facts like duties, obligations, seem to only make sense within a personalistic context. So if there's some sort of moral fact of the matter to which I am wholly and rightfully obligated, and which prescribes my behavior, you have to, I think, explain it in terms of something that's transcendent but personal. And that are categories which a metaphysically naturalistic worldview doesn't provide you with.
This is dangerous talk in Conway Hall. You're going to get it now. You want to have a go?
Well, first of all, I think we atheists, in the views of God, are much better creatures, because we don't need the reward in heaven that you believers are promised. So we are sui generis, good. And I also think that if I were to search for my own, the foundation of my own moral code, it would be something like, and I need to work on this, but it would be something like not to thwart the aspirations of others. Because we're more or less all equally lucky accidents. And some of us are luckier accidents than others, of course, but on the whole we're just accidents on this earth. And so, in a sense, we're more or less equal in the eyes of non-God. And so not thwarting the aspirations of others seems to be quite a good code. Now, of course you have to draw the line, because there are some people, like Hitler, whose aspirations should have been thwarted. But since he was in the business of thwarting the aspirations of millions, you've got a pretty good moral reason for thwarting his particular aspiration. But on the whole, you get by in this world by not thwarting.
Sure. But of course, the moral argument I just enunciated was not an argument about moral motivation, which is what you would be criticizing by talking about, you're only behaving morally because you believe in a God with a big stick in the sky. Mine was an argument about moral ontology, explaining what kind of thing is an objective moral value. And again, for purposes of argument, I could be perfectly happy to agree with Peter Atkins that we can all recognize the objective value, should be we should promote everybody having their way unless they're doing the opposite, kind of thing. But the question is that itself something I am objectively obligated to pursue? And if so, what ontological view of reality, which worldview best accommodates the existence of such a fact, which we jointly recognize?
So, let me address this. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize. Let me address the ontological argument quickly. I mean, I've already said I don't really see the idea of a super being adds much to the fact that here we are, human beings with common dispositions to achieve certain aims, prevent certain ills. Now, you're worried that, well, that doesn't give us much objectivity beyond what we're commonly disposed to do, and you'd rather have a higher authority. I actually think this is a positively dangerous idea. I mean, think about the case where this matters, where you have two communities who disagree about what's to be done because they have fairly basic dispositions which diverge. And in that situation, it seems to me the best thing is for one side to say to the other, well, look at what's going to happen if you do this. You're repressing certain people, you're causing suffering, you're going to store up trouble for the future, and appeal to considerations like that. Now, one would hope that if they're, as we say, in the wrong, that will persuade them. If it doesn't persuade them, it doesn't seem to me a very helpful idea to say, and what's more, you're wrong, right? Because they're going to disagree about that, and it just looks like a recipe for disaster to bring in this big ontological stick. as an extra consideration over and above pointing out the suffering, benefits, and so on that will follow from their actions, seems to me just a bad thing.
But then, yeah, sure.
Briefly.
I'm not bringing in the ontological stick as a motivational stick. I'm not joining in the pragmatic conversation of, surely you can see if you behave this way, certain results will follow. It's purely a matter of arguing which worldview is true or not, which as a philosopher I think matters as well as the pragmatics of how people behave.
If you could stick to that, that would be a good thing.
But the bottom line is that society's stumbled in to what you are calling sort of moral objectivity.
Is it wrong to torture children for fun because God says so? Or does God say it's wrong to torture children for fun because it is? And as a wider question, if God were to come down to Conway Hall now and announce it's good to torture children, who would you side with, God or your own moral feelings?
Good, okay. So we have two questions. One is the famous Ufficio dilemma from Plato's dialogues, but updated in monotheistic terms. So is what's good, according to me, good because God says so, or does God say so because it's good? And if I say, well, it's good because God says so, then that makes morality arbitrary, depending upon God's whim of his will, rather than objective and absolute and so on. If I say, no, he says so because it is good, then the idea would be, well, that means that the good is something that is independent of God's will, and therefore, and this is the mistake in the argument, independent of bringing God into the argument. But it's a false dilemma because there is more to God than his will. So the standard reply from the theistic side here is to say, of course, it's not, generally speaking, to put the writer for later, that things are good because God says so. He says they're good because they are, but the fact that they are, although it's independent of his willing, is not independent of his character and existence. God has a certain essence, a necessarily existent character, which is the standard of the good. God is the good in Platonic terms, and in line with that character, he will issue his commands and obligations to us.
Can I just follow up?
Well, simply as a reply to the Ufficio dilemma idea that the theistic grounding of morality falls into the Ufficio dilemma, to point out that it's a false dilemma and that there's another option is to show that the objection doesn't work.
Could I ask a point of information? Does that imply there's a higher power than God which prevents God from saying it's good to torture children?
No.
Can
we hear Peter? Do you want to?
Yes, if we were to broaden this discussion away from St. Peter's Christian perspective and look at the Quran, then we find that as the Quran got dictated or written, then God was constantly changing his mind, having to correct himself at various stages. So there are examples of God taking different decisions, depending upon the needs of Muhammad, I think.
Certainly, I think he's... Yeah, I'm not here as a representative of Islam, but I do believe within Islamic theology there's much more an emphasis upon God's will rather than character, whereas within the Christian tradition it's more the character that is the centre. So God is love, as it says in the New Testament, and then in line with that loving character he will adduce certain obligations upon us.
Does atheism bestow an evolutionary advantage either to the individual or to the society?
I'm going to go to Peter at the end.
Yes.
Peter too.
I don't know, is the short answer, but I think it may be the case that in the early days of human evolution, then belief in a deity possibly did have advantages for stability and so on, and encouraging warriors to go out and do things. In the modern world, I would have thought not much advantage, really, and probably more advantage now to be a disbeliever than a believer.
That's a very interesting question. Somehow I've never really thought about it. So there is a standard view that, which I find plausible, that a tendency towards religious belief is a kind of spandrel. It's a side effect of our inclination to see agency in nature, which is much more widespread and clearly of an evolutionary advantage. We can detect animals, tell them from the stones and so on, react accordingly. Still, there seems to be a question of whether it was advantageous or not, and historically it might well have been advantageous. You might feel that if it wasn't advantageous, there would have been selection pressures, either of an individual genetic kind or of some social kind against it. But then it looks like an empirical question. It'd be very interesting to look through history and see how many atheist societies there were. I mean, did they get selected out because they were deficient, disadvantaged in this way? Were there different circumstances that conduced to atheism in different societies? Chinese societies tend to be less religious. Very interesting.
If I can add a rider to that, I think also there's a difference between monotheism and polytheism, that polytheism can absorb, whereas monotheism can't. Because you can, if you've got 100 gods, then you could easily extend it to 101, just bringing one more attribute. Whereas if you've got monotheism, you've got to go and protect that god. And so there is a difference within belief as well as between belief and atheism.
Does ought imply can? If we lack free will, can we be morally obligated to do anything at all? And isn't atheism, in effect, committed to our not having free will? I'm not sure about that, but I'm going to pass this over to Peter at the end.
Yeah,
go on. Have a stab at that.
Had I free will, I would have declined to answer. We do have free will in the sense that our response to input is unpredictable. I mean, just as if you take a double pendulum about the simplest physical object you can imagine apart from an actual pendulum, one pendulum hanging from another pendulum, then its condition is quite unpredictable after a short time. And I think our brains are much more complex, at least some of us, than just a double pendulum. And so it's inconceivable, really, that a precise prediction about future behavior can be made about a brain in any environment. But there are neuroscientific studies of decision making, which is very interesting, where the brain takes decisions before you are aware of them, and you simply act them out, which really undermines some aspects of what we mean by free will. So, in a sense, I'm disputing your premise rather than...
I don't understand why you seem to think that because it doesn't seem that we can, in principle, predict human behaviour, that therefore means we do have free will. It's purely contingent that we can't predict. I mean, we make a lot of our better brains that allow us to predict. So I don't really think that answer possible.
Can I come in? I kind of agree with the comeback of the questioner, but in this respect, I don't think it's a good idea to argue for free will on the basis of unpredictability. So, what can we? There's there's my son. He's about to be evicted if he doesn't have some money. I've got some money. It's entirely predictable. You could bet your house on it. I'm going to do this. There's a situation where it's for sure I'm going to do it. Does it follow from that I'm not acting freely? Of course I'm acting freely. It's a paradigm of acting freely. So the contrast isn't between freedom and determinism. It's between freedom and being determined by the wrong things. If somebody manipulates my brain or holds a gun to my head, then I'm arguably not free. But if
your family is holding a gun to your head.
No, so you didn't let me finish. I mean, if in that sense my family is holding a gun to my head, that's precisely the case where I am acting freely. Where I'm determined through a chain of causation that goes through my character, through my beliefs, through my awareness of what's happening, through my aims and desires, and leads to an action. It might do that in an entirely predictable and deterministic way, but provided the determination goes through my character and my aims and ambitions, then that's a case of acting freely. And where people aren't acting freely is where they're being manipulated by some process that doesn't go through that route. So I don't think there's anything in determinism or materialism to rule out free will.
The idea is that your beliefs and your aims, they are themselves the product of antecedent causes.
So and what I say is that if we think it through, should give us no reason to feel I'm not acting freely at all. What you want my beliefs and my desires to kind of arise by whim and cause me to act? That wouldn't be a case of acting freely. That would be a case of acting at random.
I think that's a false dilemma to say either at random or determined by things. I think free will, agent, causation, acting for purposes and reasons and so on. I think I agree with what's implicit in the questioner's position that I detect there. I think we do face a choice between libertarian free will that aligns with moral responsibility or determinism, and I think they're a pretty strong case for saying if you're a naturalist or if you're a materialist, you ought to be a determinist and actually sort of just bite the bullet and say no, with people like Dawkins and Will Provine and so on, and just bite the bullet and say no, we don't have the kind of moral responsibility that links with what you were talking about objective moral values and so on. I think if you were to argue purely physical systems behaving according to the laws of physics don't have libertarian free will. Human beings are purely physical systems behaving according to the laws of physics. If you accept both premises, surely determinism follows. It seems to me the only way to really escape that argument is to deny that people are purely physical systems.
Do you think that mathematics is discovered like science through observing the world and the universe, or it's thought up like philosophy and thought through people and developed by people or by observation?
You keep on taking this away from me. It's a very Freudian thing to do. So I'll put it in the middle in the future. I think that goes right to the heart of what we were alluding to earlier on about the reason why mathematics works as a description of physical reality. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really, that this supreme creation of the human philosophical mind, if you like, the mathematical mind anyway, maps so wonderfully onto the workings of the outside physical world that it really does point to being more than a coincidence. So I think as we move towards a deep understanding of the nature of the physical reality, seeing more and more the role of mathematics in it, we'll move towards an answer to that kind of question.
So, do I have to talk like this? Where are we? So is it made? I think mathematics is made up. I think mathematics is a kind of story about what may as well be a fictional world of numbers and sets and so on. And it's kind of separate, it's outside space and time. And down here is the physical world. But the physical world does have various kind of complicated structural features that are very nicely modeled by thinking about these abstract objects. And that's how it is. Now, isn't it amazing that the abstract objects we have here are just the ones that you would need to model the structures that the physical world has? I don't think it's an accident. I think we've developed those mathematical models precisely with an eye to giving ourselves a way of modeling the structure the physical world has. So I don't find it as mysterious as some people do.
I'll put it there. I think quite the opposite. Though we're on the same side, I actually think that it's a clue about the deep structure of the fabric of reality, and I think we can't go beyond that at the moment.
Hi. Well, I have two questions. Firstly, when we did accept that you can't really disregard a policy because you haven't found scientific evidence for it first, but then, Peter, you said that the afterlife was nonsense and you believed that its concept was harmful. But as of present, what scientific evidence have you got to prove that it doesn't exist to come to such a conclusion? And secondly, regards to the actual title, Can Science Solve Every Mystery? When a terrible disaster strikes, why is it that people turn to a higher power as opposed to the laws of nature or physics?
On the second, religion is so much easier than science. I mean, you don't have to work on belief, you just slip into it. Whereas to understand anything in science, you've got to work really, really hard. And people just can't be bothered or give up. It's too much of a challenge. I think that's one of the drivers of the great importance of scientific communicators, to help people see the depth to which science can go in revealing the nature of reality. As to the first one, the evidence for the afterlife, well, there is none. Not one iota of evidence. The afterlife is driven by corporations, that is, institutions of religion, who find it a supreme method of control of the behavior of individuals, and internally by individuals who cannot come to terms with the prospect of their own annihilation.
Do you want to answer at this point? I've got a rather abstract epistemological observation to make.
Oh, okay. I mentioned earlier in my presentation my book, Understanding Jesus, 5 Ways to Spiritual Enlightenment. There's a chapter in there on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I could also punt you to... I could punt you to a very thick book by N.T. Wright or Michael Licona, works by Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig, or Richard Swinburne's The Resurrection of the Son of God.
So that's interesting, because this is slightly different from the questioner's question. You were offering positive evidence for various religious doctrines. Your proposition was, where was the evidence against the afterlife? And I think the right thing to say to your question is, look, the absence of evidence against is not a sufficient reason for belief. I mean, if there's no evidence either way, we should suspend belief. Bertrand Russell's famous example. Maybe there's a teapot orbiting in there with asteroids, and I've got no evidence against that, so should I believe it? No, I should suspend belief, and given the initial unlikeliness of it, I should have a very, 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 very low degree of belief in it in the absence of any positive evidence. And that's kind of what I feel about the afterlife too. If you've got positive evidence, that's a different thing.
Hello, I'd like to hear Peter Atkins' reasons for thinking that philosophy isn't very useful.
It's not very useful. When did I say that?
David was expecting you to say it more forcefully, but
yes,
I'm sure
I think the position I take on philosophy, not the whole of philosophy, this doesn't apply to moral philosophy and political philosophy and jurisprudence and so on. It applies when philosophers interfere with science, like you were talking about earlier today. And indeed, all your examples were of science rather than philosophy, by the way. I think philosophy tends to be pessimistic, whereas science is driven by optimism. Scientists go out suspecting and hoping and believing that their investigations will be fruitful and lead to elucidation. Philosophers are constantly tugging on their coattails, saying, you can't go down there, you can't understand that, you'll never understand that, and all that sort of thing. So the way I've put it before is to do a Turing test on two people, one a philosopher and one a scientist. Put them behind a screen, ask them all the questions you want. I think you can tell which is going to be the philosopher, because they will be largely guarded and philosophical and pessimistic, whereas the scientist will be much more optimistic, hopeful, and, well, that's true, isn't it?
I don't know which philosophers you're thinking of. Maybe you've been talking to many of your colleagues in Oxford, but the philosophers I know aren't like this. Look, here's a nice Turing test. So we get two of them behind the screen, and then we say, look, I've been reading a few elementary books on quantum mechanics, and this business of here's a wave function and it's spread out, and then the electron interacts with a measuring apparatus, and suddenly the wave packet collapses instantaneously across the distance. That doesn't really make much sense to me. And one behind the screen says, oh, well, that's very puzzling. We better try and think about it. Maybe we aren't thinking about the theory in the right way. Maybe there's some stuff that quantum mechanics doesn't tell us about yet. We better investigate it. And the other one says, don't be silly, the equations work, we can make predictions. That's not the kind of question we ask in lectures. You're not cut out to be a physicist. Which one do you think is the physicist?
Well, they're clearly both scientists.
They're both natural philosophers, of course.
I was wondering what you thought had more validity, starting out with mathematics and going into scientific principles, or going the other way, whereas Einstein arrived at most of his things through pure thought, and then only a bit of mathematics was brought in at the end, whereas Newton did near enough all of it with maths and then went to scientific principles towards the end. Just wondering which way was more valid.
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy. I think that the way that science progresses is in this extraordinarily fruitful collaboration of theorists and observers. And to say one is following the other and the other one following the other, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think it's, and it would be wrong to set it up as a dichotomy as well. It's, I think the essence of science, at all levels of science really, is collaboration.
Yes, Peter Williams, you mentioned, although this question's for everyone, you mentioned this idea of verified religious knowledge. I hope I've got the phrase right. I found what you were talking about very interesting, because you were talking about an anecdote from J.P. Morland about someone realizing that they'd kind of somehow tuned into some verifiable knowledge about an individual in the audience. He also talked about Herod predicting some kind of downfall. I was wondering if you and the others thought there might be alternative explanations for why that might not be a religious experience. I mean, for example, such as coincidences.
Certainly. One would want to run the numbers, in a sense, on that kind of, I suppose there are examples of specified, of design detection by specified complexity, aren't they, really? But also, I think, how plausible you think those examples are is going to depend upon the worldview assumptions you're bringing to it. And I mentioned in my talk about the way in which, if one thought that philosophically one had justification for belief in a certain metaphysical worldview, one thought one had good reasons for believing that a certain purported revelation was a true revelation from God and so on, that context would be epistemologically key in, say, how seriously you took certain religious experiences, so that it wasn't just the experience on its own that I was appealing to, Certainly if you want to use that kind of experience to make an argument for God or something, you're going to be placing a lot more weight upon that argument than you do in the day-to-day religious life of the normal believer. So there was slightly sort of two different parallel points that I was making with the examples.
Am I allowed to make a point? Can I just, yes, okay, yeah. I had a similar concern about those particular anecdotes because it seemed to me that if I believed in psychic powers, for example, if that was the worldview that I arrived with, I would, I might agree with your comments that philosophy and science might support belief in psychic powers, might do. I mean, I don't think it does, but it might do. And you made the point that, well, it might possibly validate religious experience. Well, it might possibly validate psychic experiences too, possibly. I don't think it has, but it might do. And then you went on to trot out 3 anecdotes of the sort that you would find on Psychic Sally's website. I mean, she'll say, you know what, this happened, I predicted it, and the very next week it happened, and then, all of those kinds of cases are just par for the course in the psychic world. So I'm now looking at your belief system and the belief system of the psychic, and I want to know why one is considerably more rational than the other one.
Okay. Again, that's going to come down to the two elements, the background beliefs and the particular beliefs. So I agree with you about the key thing of this. Well, it might be thought to. The key question is, does it or does it not? Because I'm approaching this from a viewpoint of thinking, I think it does support this particular philosophical religious position. As someone who's approaching it with the thought that actually philosophically it doesn't, I can see why rationally they're going to disagree with me, because we have this prior disagreement. So that is key. But also then it does come down to things like running the numbers and the trustworthiness of the witnesses and so on, whether or not you think the guy is just making up or lying, whether you have, in some of the examples I gave, say with predictive fulfilled prophecy, whether you have good historical evidence that a certain prophecy existed before the event that it's meant to prophesy, whether or not you have good historical evidence that the prophesied event actually happened, whether or not the prophecy is such a Barnum statement along the lines of the sort of things you can read in your horoscope in the newspaper every day, that it has a lack of specificity that means there's no significance to it, or whether you think does it have that specificity, does it meet it, what is the evidence, and so on. Obviously, I was just bringing up some examples, but I agree, those are going to be the key questions to ask, and your differing opinion of the answer to those questions will determine your opinion of the examples. Yeah.
And there's a certain naivety in the examples anyway. I mean, even the prediction of the fall of the temple, that was written in Gospels that were written well after the event.
I would dispute that. I would dispute that historical claim.
And also, I think in the modern day examples that you might care to comment on in your final 30 seconds is when the test of being a saint, when in the Vatican the doctors have to say that it is inconceivable that this has an actual medical explanation. It must have been due to the intercession of Pope John Paul directly with God. That means that these doctors are incompetent, not that they're making a correct judgment.
Well, I wouldn't like to comment on the professional conduct of people outside my realm of expertise, but one would certainly want to ask questions about the prior motivational structure, as we've just asked. But I'd certainly dispute the historical claim about the prophecy example, and I could certainly point to many other examples. I'll point you to my chapter, because I've only got 30 seconds, to the chapter of my book on fulfilled prophecy in the Understanding Jesus book, which goes through very much what is the specificity of the predictions, when is the historical evidence for it existing, how far prior to the fulfillment, what is the historical evidence of the fulfillment, what would one calculate in a very conservative manner the odds being, and so on. And those are all very sensible questions I agree to ask about it. I'm not asking for a credulity of trust in here, but I am asking for an investigation of the actual data and where it points, vis-a-vis relative to what background beliefs you're bringing to that data being important as well.